Hi, this is River from Developing Australian Communities. I'm one of the co-founders here, and today I'm speaking to the amazing Mandy Maisie, who is the president of the Tourette Syndrome Association, all about Tourette Syndrome Awareness Week this week. How are you, Mandy?
I'm great, thank you.
What's your connection with Tourette Syndrome?
I am the mother of three people with Tourette syndrome, and through having three kids with Tourette's, I became a member of Tourette Syndrome Association fairly rapidly, so that in my quest for knowledge, I had as much information as I could. From there, I realised I needed to know more and do more, so I became a support group leader. And then from there, I needed to know more and do more, so I became a committee member. And then from there, vice president and now president, because my quest for needing to know more and do more continues.
And what is Tourette syndrome? So what does it look like, and what goes on for someone on the inside that we might not necessarily be seeing for those that are living with it?
So Tourette syndrome being a neurological condition, usually outwardly is characterized by something called tics. So those are movements or vocalizations. That's what the general public or the wider community would actually see. For people with Tourette syndrome being a neurological condition, movements, and they can be fairly erratic. They are unwanted, involuntary movements, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Tourette syndrome. You have the additional things. So mental tics are quite a big thing. So in the same way that you would have a repetitive movement or a vocalization, you would have a repetitive thought that would go over and over and over. Syndrome goes hand in hand. Now, it used to be that they thought it was a comorbid with OCD, but now the current line of thinking with medical experts is that actually they're so intermeshed now that OCD really is, Tourette's is integral with OCD. Now, you can have OCD on its own, but you can't necessarily have Tourette syndrome without the OCD to a certain extent. So you've got the added OCD component. So you've got obsessive and compulsive movements and vocalizations, as well as Tourette syndrome as well, which is like a neurological impulse. So added to that, people with Tourette syndrome are all often autistic or neurodivergent in some way, so ADHD or other neurological neurodivergence. So it is quite a complicated condition, and it can be very debilitating.
And what's the first responder focus this week all about?
So we've noticed that there is a deficit in the training for first responders. Now, first responders do an incredible job. They are amazing. And without them, we'd be lost. But we are finding that people with Tourette syndrome are reporting, there's only about 28% of people with Tourette syndrome are reporting a positive interaction with first responders, whereas the general public, it would be about 96%. And then you've got the added concern that first responders themselves will admit, I think it's 1 in 5, admit that they would confuse ticking behavior with being on drugs. And then first responders often confuse tics with erratic or violent behavior. And in a situation where you have got people that are in a vulnerable position, usually when you access first responders, you're in a vulnerable position. And so you've got these snap judgments that are being made because first responders need to make a decision in the blink of an eye for everybody's safety. Often they're making the wrong decisions or drawing the wrong conclusions by their interactions with people with Tourette syndrome.
So it sounds like awareness is a big one. So I imagine as a first responder, if you're not aware that that might even be something that's on the cards, you might even think to ask the question, is this drug related or is this actually, Tourette syndrome? Do you have something that I should know about?
Yeah, exactly. It's about asking, is there any way I can help? What can I do for you? Are you okay? Rather than assuming that there's, that it's drink or drugs.
And when it comes to looking at Tourette's, I think we talk about disability. We're hearing a little bit more about it with the NDIS and funded services. At what point does it become a disability? Because a lot of people may think, well, okay, it's sounds and it's movements, but at what point does that become a disability where someone might actually need kind of funded supports?
So there's numerous reasons why somebody might need to access NDIS funding for Tourette syndrome. If you're really lucky with Tourette syndrome, you might just have the grunting or the sniffing or the tics that aren't particularly noticeable. These still have a social and an emotional impact and an impact overall on your mental health. So for some people with Tourette syndrome, they have something called functional tics. And I know that my youngest, they're 12, and they've had functional tics for about 3 years now, which means that they regularly have to access a wheelchair. Now, a wheelchair isn't a cheap thing, and you can get secondhand ones, but when you're having to use it on a regular basis, you want to know that it's of a reasonable condition. Added on to that, I, during one of their drop tick episodes, actually ended up having a torn rotator cuff, which has been exacerbated now for 10 months because of the constant lifting and carrying and into the wheelchair, out of the wheelchair, into bed, out of bed. That has a lot of wear and tear. Now, if I was accessing NDIS, I might be able to get the equipment that would help me do the lifting and carrying, or even access a support worker that would be able to come in and give me a hand with that. And these are really important things. There are people with Tourette syndrome that can't necessarily go about their daily business doing household chores and things because of some tics causing them to injure themselves. So being able to access a support worker at home, or just take the pressure off a family that has 3 members of the family with Tourette syndrome, that is absolutely worn out to their nth degree, to be able to access some form of support or access help in some way is invaluable.
And of course, with the rollout of NDIS, one of the things that we've seen a lot less of is respite funding that focuses on, carers or parents or people that are in a person's life that are informal supports, because we tend to fund the person as opposed to the people that support them. So we don't see a lot of those breaks, and that's funded support, which is a big one, I know, for families. In terms of mainstream services, what sort of services, like in terms of like Medicare funded services, might someone with Tourette's access?
Mainstream funding, really, when it comes to, you get your 10 sessions of psychology a year, which is usually subsidized by Medicare, and you can access things like physio, and those would be subsidized. Public support, the public system is so oversubscribed. The waiting lists are absolutely horrendous. So having to wait for things constantly is a massive drain on people with Tourette syndrome.
And a lot would use specialists as well, I'm imagining. So psychiatrists, neurologists. Yes. Is medication something that people with Tourette's sometimes access?
Yes. So people will they need to access psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, and the medications as well that are required. Not everybody does medicate for Tourette syndrome, and that's a personal choice. But to be able to access some of the medications for Tourette syndrome is actually quite an expensive thing, because not everything's covered by PBS.
What would be your top tips, I guess, for someone that isn't sure, that meets a person with Tourette syndrome, in terms of how they interact? Is there like a set of a few top tips or a general approach that we like people to use? Like, say I'm walking down the street, I meet someone with Tourette's. What's the best way for me to interact?
So, common human decency. It's one of those things. If you're in a social situation with somebody with Tourette's and you're having a conversation, there's no reason why you can't ask somebody. Most people with Tourette syndrome are quite happy to talk to you about their condition. But if you're in the street and you see somebody ticking, then you just ignore it. If you're in a school setting and there is somebody ticking, generally you would ignore it. But then there are other times when you're in a social setting and somebody is ticking, and it's actually quite funny. And then it's really awkward if people don't actually react in any way, shape, or form. If you ignore it at that point, it becomes just an awkward, pregnant pause in the conversation.
And what sorts of things does the Tourette Syndrome Association of Australia do?
So, Tourette Syndrome Association of Australia run support groups throughout Australia. We have an annual camp program that we run in all of the states across Australia for people with Tourette's and their families. And we try and educate. So we try and educate schools. We try and we'll do school talks. We're happy to talk to businesses. Like Tourette's Awareness Week this week, we every year we have an awareness week where we try and shed light on one particular thing. This year, it's first responders. We've put together a toolkit for first responders with a de-escalation guide and how best to approach Tourette syndrome. And we've done one for the general public, which is a little less based on first response, but more about general response, I guess. So we're always out there trying to get the message across and trying to provide what support we can. We are trying to lobby the government at the moment to try and get something together for a national guideline for the diagnosis of Tourette syndrome and also a treatment pathway, because currently there isn't an official diagnosis and treatment pathway for Tourette syndrome.
And I guess if we're looking at things like the NDIS and the way we fund or support, people with Tourette's in Australia, is there something you'd like to say, I guess, or call on the leaders around Australia as they're starting to look at and rejig things like NDIS and Medicare in terms of getting services and things set up well for people with Tourette's?
Really, they need to speak to the Tourette's community, and rather than making the decisions without involving people with Tourette's, you can't make decisions about how a condition affects somebody without actually discussing it with the community themselves. But the people that know the most about a condition are the people that actually suffer from it, rather than the medical establishment, who are actually on our side and actually trying to get things changed for us. But NDIS really has to have a strong look at building a relationship between the communities themselves and NDIS to actually get the right outcomes.
Thank you so much, Mandy. I'm talking to the president of the Tourette Syndrome Association of Australia, Mandy Mazey. This week is Tourette Syndrome Awareness Week, and there's a huge focus on the first responder and how we can better support first responders in Australia understanding Tourette syndrome. Thank you so much for your time, Mandy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.